Most experimental aircraft never make it into production, but many feature revolutionary design elements that regularly end up on military and commercial planes, sometimes decades later. From fanciful dragons and flying pancakes and pusher-pullers to tail-sitters, the aircrafts in today's video were among the boldest designs of their day. That said, some now reside in dusty warehouses and lonely scrapyards, while others have been lovingly restored and occupy prominent positions in aviation museums around the world. So, today, 4 groundbreaking aircraft of yesteryear. Though they're not so well known these days, Dornier Do 335 Arrows were the fastest piston-powered aircraft in the Luftwaffe during World War II. Twin-engine planes were common then, but unlike nearly all of its contemporaries, the Arrow had its dual power plants housed in the fuselage, one in front of the cockpit and one behind it. This allowed it to benefit from the power of 2 engines while retaining the aerodynamic slipperiness associated with traditional single-engine fighters. The Do 335V1 first flew in October of 1943, but though the performance was encouraging, a number of mechanical and handling issues came to light, which were addressed in later variants with improved cockpits and strengthened undercarriages. Keen to capitalize on the revolutionary design and in dire need of new fighters and interceptors to help turn the tide of the air war in Europe, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering ordered the Arrow into production after a relatively short development period. The final production variant first took to the skies in late January of 1944 after only 60 hours of flight time. Test pilots described the Arrow as fast and reliable, and more than a match for the American twin-engine P-38 Lightning in nearly every respect. Though additional bomber, destroyer, and ground attack variants were planned, none actually went into production. It was expected that more than 2,000 units would be produced, but labor, fuel, and material shortages caused by round-the-clock Allied bombardment kept production to less than 50. But though the Do 335 made its debut during the late stages of the war, its origins dated back decades when company founder Claude Dornier developed a number of non-traditional multi-engine aircraft. In the Do-26 flying boat, he housed the plane's 4 engines in 2 nacelles beside the fuselage in the same push-pull configuration that would later be used in the Arrow. In addition to power and aerodynamic advantages, the layout counteracted persistent torque issues referred to as asymmetrical thrust, which was caused by multiple engines turning in the same direction. However, with push-pull aircraft, one engine's torque negates the others, which makes for straighter, faster, and more efficient flight. At 45 feet long and with a nearly identical wingspan, the Dornier was only slightly bigger than other single-engine fighters of the day, but it was much heavier. The Arrow had an empty weight of more than 16,000 pounds and a gross weight of more than 21,000 pounds. Early prototypes were equipped with various engines, but later models featured 2 massive 44-litre Daimler-Benz DB603E1 inverted liquid-cooled V12s, each of which produced about 1,800 horsepower at takeoff and drove constant-speed propellers nearly 12 feet across. Top speed was 474 miles per hour at 21,300 feet, and even with one engine switched off, the Arrow could hit 350 miles per hour. To put these numbers in perspective, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in Mustangs and Spitfires displaced just 27 litres and produced between 1,300 and 1,500 horsepower until the war's end, when more powerful versions were introduced. With top speeds of 369 miles per hour and 436 miles per hour respectively, Dorniers could outrun their adversaries with relative ease, though they didn't handle as well thanks to the added weight. Armament included one centrally mounted 30mm cannon with 70 rounds of ammunition and 2 20mm cannons mounted in the cowl, each with 200 rounds. 2,200-pound bomb loads could be carried in an internal bay, as well as from hardpoints under the wings. In April of 1945, famed French aviator Pierre Clostermann encountered a Do 335 while leading a flight of Hawker Tempests over Germany. With a top end of more than 430 miles an hour, Clostermann's Tempest wasn't a slouch in the speed department, but when he attempted to engage the Arrow, it simply accelerated away from him before he could get a good shot. After the war, at least one Do 335 was shipped overseas for testing and assessment. In April of 1945, one suffered an engine fire and crashed into a schoolyard near the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Another is now on display in Chantilly, Virginia, at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. Once envisioned as a state-of-the-art Cold War sub-hunter, now the sole remaining Bartini-Beriev VVA-14 more resembles a long-forgotten sci-fi movie prop than an actual flying machine. Even in its heyday, if it really ever had one, the VVA-14 was often referred to as Zmai Gorenik, after a fearsome dragon in a Russian folk story, and with 3 head-stubby wings and 2 bulbous haunches, it really did look the part. Conceived by eccentric Italian expat Robert Bartini, who'd lived in the Soviet Union since the early 1920s, the VVA-14 was a flying boat designed to take off and land vertically like a helicopter, then streak across the sky at high subsonic speeds on its quest to find and destroy enemy nuclear ballistic missile submarines. The letters in its name are an acronym for Vertical Takeoff Amphibious Aircraft, and to achieve such incredible feats, the revolutionary aircraft would need 14 engines. Not surprisingly, this is why it was so expensive, so impractical, and ultimately relegated to the scrapyard in favor of cheaper, easier to produce, and more effective traditional aircraft. Meant to be little more than a preliminary test bed in a long research and development process, the first Beriev had a crew of 3, was approximately 85 feet long, had a wingspan of nearly 100 feet, and weighed about 52,000 pounds empty. However, due to huge fuel and ordnance loads and sophisticated sub-hunting equipment, later models were expected to be at least twice as heavy. To get the big birds airborne vertically, each would be fitted with 12 turbofan lift engines producing 10,000 pounds of thrust apiece. Then, once aloft, forward thrust for horizontal flight would be provided by 2 larger Soloviev D30M turbofan engines producing 15,000 pounds of thrust each. Top speed was expected to be in the neighborhood of 475 miles per hour, with a relatively efficient cruising speed of 400 miles per hour and a range approaching 1,500 miles. Designers tinkered with rigid and inflatable pontoons, folding wings, and multiple power plant configurations, but when the first prototype flew in September of 1972, it took off from a conventional runway because its lift engines hadn't been installed. In fact, between 1972 and 1975, only 107 test flights were recorded, totaling just over 100 hours, none of which came anywhere close to achieving the aforementioned performance goals. In the end, only the first prototype ever actually flew, and when Bartini died in 1974, his dream for a high-speed VTOL sub-hunter killer perished with him. Additional testing was performed immediately after his death, but Soviet military brass realized that the VVA-14's effectiveness would be limited, that its payload and performance projections were hopelessly unrealistic, and that it was cost-prohibitive to produce. Of the 2 remaining examples, one was sent to the Central Air Force Museum in Moscow in the late 80s, and the other was scrapped. The former can still be seen on the grounds outside the Central Air Force Museum in a state of advanced decay, ironically emblazoned with Aeroflot numbers and logos, though it thankfully never flew a civil aviation role. No one would want to step on board that. During the Second World War, the Vought Company produced an odd-shaped experimental fighter for the US Navy called the XF-5U Flying Pancake. Whereas most aircraft consist of distinct fuselages, wings, cockpits, and tail surfaces, the XF-5U's designers sought to incorporate these elements into one relatively unified shape. It was a big gamble during the war when resources were scarce and time was of the essence, but the design promised a multitude of benefits that were nothing short of groundbreaking for the day. The disc-shaped aircraft was what was referred to as a lifting surface, or in contemporary jargon, a lifting body. In traditional airplanes, wings provide nearly all lift, but in lifting bodies, the entire underside of the aircraft does this, which means that wings can be shorter and narrower and have smaller surface areas. Another benefit of this design was that the XF-5U was more robust than traditional aircraft, which meant that it could withstand higher G-loads, a huge bonus in dogfighting as well as ground attack. The XF-5U was derived from an earlier, smaller prototype, but the promise of low stall speed, high angles of attack, good visibility, and enough lift and power to carry a heavy weapons load remained there. The XF-5U was derived from an earlier, smaller prototype, and the promise of low stall speed, high angles of attack, good visibility, and enough lift to power and carry a heavy weapons load is very tempting. 2 1,400 plus horsepower Pratt & Whitney XR2002 radial engines buried in the stubby round wings drove large propellers at the wingtips. At over 28 feet long and with a wingspan of over 32 feet, the plane was narrow, but with a maximum takeoff weight of 18,700 pounds, it certainly wasn't light. The Pancake's top speed was estimated to be 452 miles per hour, but its 710-mile range and 34,500-foot service ceiling weren't particularly impressive considering twin-engine P-38s had actual top speeds of about 420 miles per hour and could climb to 46,000 feet. Proposed armaments included 6 50-caliber machine guns and a bomb load of about 2,000 pounds. Though initial signs were encouraging, test flights at Vort's facility in Connecticut revealed a number of inherent problems, the most troubling of which were rumbling vibrations that frequently and unexpectedly coursed through the airframe. To counteract wingtip vortices that created drag and torque, engineers replaced the original propellers with ones taken from the company's F-4U-4 fighter, which resolved a number of issues. An ejection seat and more powerful engines were added later, but timing wasn't on Vort's side. Of the 2 prototypes built, only one, XF-5U-1, actually flew, and its future was bleak. In short, the writing was on the wall. The design would require years of additional development at huge cost, and even more importantly, everyone knew that jet engines would power the warbirds of the future. By 1947, over budget and way off schedule, the project was axed and the prototype was sent to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. The second, not so lucky. It was demolished with a wrecking ball and sold for scrap. Known as a tail-sitter for the way it took off and landed on its rudder and elevators, and Pogo for the way it hopped up and down on initial test flights, the Convair XFY was one of the boldest experimental aircraft of the 1950s. Featuring delta wings and massive 3-bladed propellers driven by a powerful turboprop engine, in many ways it promised to be the specialized fighter of the future. After World War II, developing VTOL aircraft was a top priority for many of the world's navies and air forces. As such, the Pogo was designed to protect fleets and convoys that didn't have the benefit of carrier protection. Originally intended as a fighter, interceptor, and reconnaissance platform capable of operating from small warships, development began in early 1951 when the US Navy awarded contracts to Lockheed and Convair. Though both companies were required to build 2 prototypes each, due to cost restraints and engineering difficulties, they produced only one each. The single-seat Pogo was 32 feet long and had a wingspan of over 27 feet. Though heavy with a maximum takeoff weight of 16,250 pounds, power was more than adequate thanks to its Allison turboprop that generated more than 5,000 horsepower, or nearly 3 times as much as the average piston engine fighter of World War II. And future variants were slated for even more muscle, some of which may have had engines with 8,000 horsepower. Power surged through the drive shaft to contra-rotating 6-bladed Curtiss Wright propellers that measured 15 feet across. This combination counteracted the engine's torque and moved enough air to lift the stubby machine skyward slowly before it would transition to horizontal flight and accelerate to a top speed of nearly 475 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Range would be about 500 miles, and at about 1,000 feet per minute, rate of climb was expected to be exceptional by propeller aircraft standards. Armament would include 4 20mm cannons and 4 dozen 70mm rockets. But like most experimental aircraft, the Pogo had a few major problems that just couldn't be overcome. Takeoff wasn't particularly difficult under controlled conditions, but landing was. Pilots had to look over their shoulders while judging the distance to the ground and feathering the throttle to ensure a controlled descent. This proved to be a hair-raising task, even under the best of circumstances, and since the Pogo was destined to operate from tiny pads on rolling ships susceptible to strong crosswinds, it was eventually deemed nearly impossible. The first tethered test flight was conducted in April of 1945 inside a hangar at the Navy's Moffett Field facility in Mountain View, California. Never before had such a large, powerful manned aircraft attempted to take off and land vertically, and tensions were certainly high. The plane was secured with multiple tethers to prevent it from surging upwards, falling backwards, or teetering over on its side, all of which were likely since the design was largely untested. The Pogo did manage to get a few meters off the ground without incident, and over the following months, test pilots logged almost 60 hours of airtime before additional outdoor tests were undertaken. The most successful of these took place in early August of 1954, when a test pilot reached the staggering height of 150 feet. 4 days later, the first transition to horizontal flight was achieved, but it was determined that once the powerful aircraft got moving, it just didn't want to slow down. In the end, however, it was the treacherous nature of vertical landings and its lackluster flight performance that doomed the Pogo. In the age of fighter jets capable of exceeding Mach 2, its subsonic top speed was a huge disadvantage, and it would have cost a fortune to develop. The aircraft was flown to an altitude of almost 10,000 feet in February of 1955, but the program was officially cancelled the following year. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.